3 prisoners and their ill-disciplined escort arrived at the Conciergerie in Paris at first light next morning. The atmosphere in the French capital was even more oppressive than it had been in the countryside. The weather was stiflingly hot and close, and there was an air of menace and suspicion everywhere, as if nobody dared trust anybody else. People hurried about back streets, with lowered eyes as though afraid to meet the gaze of others for fear of provoking some unfounded accusation concerning their loyalty to the revolution. Soldiers of the citizens' militia, the Garde Nationale, were everywhere, and so were small bands of sans-culottes, armed with muskets and dressed in their long trousers, baggy shirts, and tall floppy hats turned over at the top, like nightcaps with tricolour rosettes. The sans-culottes women also wore swords nonchalantly stuck in their belts as they clattered noisily across the cobbles in their wooden clogs. Footsore and sweating from their exhausting trek, Susan, Barbara, and Ian looked forward to the chance to rest, even though it was within the walls of the dreaded Conciergerie, where prisoners for immediate execution or for quick token trial were taken for their short sojourn before death. At the gates, several toothless old women cackled heartily and waved their knitting needles with taunting spite as the victims were marched past into the courtyard. The famous tricoteuses, Barbara muttered with a shiver. Later on today, they'll be sitting around the guillotine, dipping their wool in the blood. She couldn't resist a macabre smile to herself at the thought of an English school teacher taking pupils on a tour of real historical events. Susan clung to her arm and turned aside with a shudder as the soldiers shoved them roughly through the gates. The prisoners were taken to a small room on one side of the courtyard, where a fat judge dressed in a black robe and a white tabard collar was sitting in an ornate chair at a small table covered in papers. The grey wig, perched askew above his porridgy face, looked filthy. Across his chest he wore a huge tricolour sash covered in food stains. Several soldiers stood guard behind the captives, and the lieutenant handed some documents to the wheezing and perspiring judge. There was a long pause while the judge perused the papers, occasionally writing with a scratchy quill. "Are we to be allowed to tell our story?" Barbara eventually asked in respectful French. The judge glared at her over his cracked pince-nez glasses. "The accused are not required to speak," he snapped, flourishing the papers. "I have the charges and the evidence here." He scanned the papers again and fixed the prisoners with cold, short-sighted eyes. "You were found in the hideout with Rouvray and D'Argenson, royalist counter-revolutionaries." Ian opened his mouth to speak, but the judge's baleful stare silenced him. "I am satisfied as to your guilt," the judge announced harshly. "You are all sentenced to immediate execution." The fateful words rang in the bare stone rooms as the judge signed the execution. The 3 companions stared aghast at one another. Ian thought for a moment of making a desperate attempt to escape. "We demand the right to speak," Barbara declared defiantly. "You have no rights," the judge shouted disdainfully. "You will be guillotined as soon as it can be arranged." He gestured to the guard with his quill. "Take them to the cells immediately!"